What do you call a newly promoted Premier League team that only spends £10 million and sells their two best players? The polite answer is up against it. The blunt answer, some Sheffield United fans would contest, is absolutely screwed. The Blades overcame adversity last season as Paul Heckingbottom and his squad navigated unpaid bills, a 3-month transfer embargo, and a lack of training facilities at times to win automatic promotion from the Championship. On the face of it, it was just another recently relegated Premier League team benefiting from parachute payments and a big budget to secure a speedy return to the top table of English football. In reality, it was a heck of a lot less straightforward. So dire were the club's finances that, at one point, Paul Heckingbottom and his team even lost access to the club's scouting and analysis system due to an unpaid bill. Another late payment led to the undersoil heating being switched off at the club's training ground after a contractor refused to refill an oil tank over an unpaid £26,000 bill. Premier League promotion is now estimated to be worth a minimum of £135 million, so unpaid £26,000 bills to contractors ought to be a thing of the past. Sheffield United have an entirely different set of problems now though. Whereas last season the club threw all of their financial might behind the playing squad in the hope of securing promotion, hence the myriad of off-field issues and even talk at one time of administration, now the attention has firmly turned to infrastructure, long-term investment, and repaying some of the club's debts. The first team squad, meanwhile, well, as Sheffield United head into their first Premier League campaign since getting relegated, with one of the lowest points tallies in the history of the division, that would appear to have been somewhat neglected. The club's star man last season, Iliman Ndiaye, and one great hope heading into this season, has already been sold for around £20 million to Marseille, and arguably the next most gifted player in the Sheffield United squad, Sander Berge, is reportedly on the verge of a £14 million move to fellow Premier League newbies Burnley at the time of this recording. The end result is grave concern that a football club nicknamed the Blades are turning up to a gunfight armed not even with a knife, but with a plastic spoon. So, given that so many people are asking the question, including many Sheffield United fans themselves, I thought that it would be worth taking a quick look at why the club seem to be so determined to get relegated, whether they are as screwed as they appear to be at first glance, and if Derby County's record-breaking points tally might be under threat this season. At the heart of Sheffield United's issues this summer lies uncertainty. Uncertainty around the club's finances, uncertainty around the future of their ownership, and grave uncertainty in regard to the contract situation with several of their most important players. Ndiaye, for example, should never have been allowed to leave Bramall Lane for just £20 million. Directly involved in a third of Sheffield United's goals last season, Ndiaye, who only turned 23 towards the back end of the campaign, scored 15 goals and made 12 assists in 52 appearances. It was a breakout campaign for the French-born Senegalese international, who joined Sheffield United from non-league Boreham Wood in 2019 as a 19-year-old, and spent much of the previous season in the shadow of Wolves' loanee Morgan Gibbs-White. Due to financial constraints though, if you wanted to be generous, or gross negligence, if you were feeling a little bit less charitable, Sheffield United failed to tie Ndiaye down on a long-term contract. Had they done so prior to last season, in which Ndiaye raised his profile not only at club level but by playing a starring role for Senegal at the World Cup, not only would they have been paying Ndiaye a lot less money than he is actually worth, he would either still be at the club or they could have demanded at least £40 million for him if he really wanted to leave. Morgan Gibbs-White, don't forget, was signed by Nottingham Forest for a potential £42.5 million, following a similarly impressive season at a young age on loan at Sheffield United, and Sheffield United received a lot less for Ndiaye than Brentford did in the Championship for Said Benrahma, Burnley for Nathan Collins, and a lot less than Watford received this summer for João Pedro. According to reports in the Sheffield Star, Sheffield United thought that they had agreed a new deal with Ndiaye this summer, and even went as far as to record an announcement video narrated by Billy Sharp and showing Sharp momentously handing Ndiaye his famous number 10 shirt in a symbolic passing of the guard from one club legend to potentially the next. Ndiaye, who spent a year in the Marseille Academy as an 11-year-old, is reported to have changed his mind though, with Sheffield United announcing that they had, quote, reluctantly accepted a bid from the French giants last week. It's hard to overstate the significance of Ndiaye's departure for Marseille in terms of his ability, importance to Paul Heckingbottom's team, and the all-round mood and feel of the club. And only recruitment that would be the envy of Tony Bloom at Brighton could replace him for as little as £20 million. The bad news didn't stop there though. Ndiaye is far from the only Sheffield United player whose contract either expired at the end of last season or who entered the final year of their deal after winning promotion. Aside from Tommy Doyle, Kieran Clark, Rida Kadra and James McAtee, who played a combined total of 107 games on loan at Bramall Lane last season, Sheffield United had 12 players whose contracts expired in June 2023, including first-choice goalkeeper Wes Foderingham, left-back Jack Robinson, and centre-forward Ollie McBurney, who was the club's joint highest scorer tied with Ndiaye on 15 goals in all competitions last season. Some, such as Ender Stevens and Billy Sharp, departed on amicable terms, having been fine servants to the club, but perhaps not being considered much use anymore in the top flight. Others, including Foderingham and McBurney, had one-year extensions triggered to keep them at the club, but are yet to sign new deals, just kicking the can further down the road. Meanwhile, Robinson agreed to a new 2-year contract on slightly improved terms. Jack O'Connell, who was so important to Chris Wilder as one of his overlapping centre-backs during Sheffield United's rise, and was, I thought, one of the standout centre-backs in the Premier League when the club finished 9th, decided to retire this summer at the age of only 29. Just 2 games into his second season of Premier League football, O'Connell suffered a serious knee injury from which he has never recovered. Sidelined for the past 3 years, and also out of contract at the end of last season, he took the tough decision to call a premature end to what was once such a promising career. In addition to Ndiaye and Berg, who are undoubtedly 2 of the 3 most valuable players that the club had coming into this season, a further 26 senior players are entering the final year of their deals this season. If you're thinking, that must be most of the Sheffield United squad, then yes, it must. And it includes the likes of John Egan, Max Lowe and George Baldock, key first-team players at Bramall Lane. The failure to tie players down has left the club vulnerable to losing them for cut-price fees or worse still for nothing, and it is unsurprising that their 2 most valuable assets, with just a year left on their existing deals, have used that leverage to force their way out. It is, in many respects, a vicious cycle and a self-fulfilling prophecy. The precarious contract situations of Ndiaye and Berg gave them easy routes out of the club, whilst also breeding doubt about the future of the club themselves, its direction, and therefore making them more likely to want out. It's not just uncertainty though. According to reports, Berg will earn £40,000 a week at Burnley, a salary demand that Sheffield United were reportedly unwilling to match. If true, it seems incredibly short-sighted to me. Signed for a club record £22 million in January 2020, injuries restricted Berg just 15 appearances when the Blades finished bottom of the Premier League 2 years ago. Though his consistency and attitude have been questioned at times in the Championship, no one can doubt his talent. And when he wanted to be last season, he was the outstanding central midfielder in the division. Because of all of those caveats, though, despite his talent, if Sheffield United had decided to sell Berg last month for a decent fee and not to a direct divisional relegation rival, and with a replacement lined up, that would have been one thing. His departure likely still would have stung and divided Sheffield United fans, but there would have been some logic behind it. To lose him just days before the beginning of the season for a fairly modest £12 million fee to a fellow newly promoted club when Sheffield United's midfield is already in tatters, Well, that is quite frankly unforgivable. It reeks of chaos, incompetence, and a lack of foresight that has characterised the club throughout this summer's transfer window. One of the most powerful tools that newly promoted teams tend to have in their arsenal is a sense of excitement, of stepping into the unknown, and that spring in the step that every player gets from the infectious positivity of the crowd. It's one of the reasons why so many teams survive in their first season following promotion, before coming down with a fatal case of second season syndrome, just as Sheffield United did in fact. The mood surrounding Sheffield United now, however, is not remotely befitting of a club that has just won promotion to the Premier League. 3 of Sheffield United's first 4 games of the season will be at home. That ought to be a huge opportunity to put some early points on the board, especially against Crystal Palace and Everton. Bramall Lane will still be bouncing for those games, don't get me wrong, but there will be an unmistakable weariness and doubt on the opening day of the season, which will only dissipate for those games that follow it if the Blades manage to pull 1 or 2 rabbits out of the hat this transfer window. The situation isn't as bad, and the mood isn't as bleak, but there are certainly some parallels between Sheffield United's pre-season preparations this season and Hull City's heading into the 2016-17 campaign. The Tigers secured an immediate return to the Premier League via the playoffs, and they had a strong squad by newly promoted standards, featuring the likes of Harry Maguire, Andy Robertson, Michael Dawson, Robert Snodgrass, Abel Hernandez and Mohamed Diame. The mood at the club remains sour, however, due to animosity between the fans and the Alam family that own the club, and over that summer, chaos ensued. Steve Bruce resigned as manager, despite having guided the Tigers to promotion, owing to disagreements with the owners. Star man Mo Diame departed for Newcastle, despite the fact that they were in the division below the Tigers, and by the opening game of the season, against the reigning Premier League champions Leicester City, Hull City hadn't made a single first-team signing. In fact, in their entire squad, they only had 13 fit senior outfield players. It made Mike Phelan's team selection pretty straightforward, but winning games and staying in the division was always likely to be beyond them. Hull City didn't capitulate that season, owing to a fairly talented core of players, but they were still relegated in 18th. There are some Sheffield United fans who would be inclined to accept such a fate this season, well aware that the Blades don't have that core or spine of Premier League quality players, or they don't know that for sure yet at least, and through fear that the reality could be a whole lot worse. Unlike Hull City 7 years ago, Sheffield United have signed some players before the opening game of the season, namely Austin Trusty from Arsenal, Bene Traore from Häcken in Sweden, Anis Slimani from Brøndby in Denmark, and Yasser Larouci on loan from French outfit Troyes. Trusty is a US international centre-back who won Birmingham City's Player of the Year award on loan from Arsenal last season. Traore is an explosive 20-year-old Ivorian winger who scored 15 goals in only 20 games last season. Slimani is a midfield all-rounder who has already won 27 caps for Tunisia and has played more than 100 games for Brøndby at the age of only 22. And Larouci is an extremely attack-minded left-back or left wing-back who came through the youth ranks at Liverpool. None are household names, and between them, they have never played a single minute of Premier League football before, but you could say the same about Moises Caicedo and Kaoru Mitoma when they were signed by Brighton. The difference, however, aside from it being very hard to sign players of Caicedo and Mitoma's calibre on a budget full stop, is that whilst Brighton were able to ease Caicedo and Mitoma into their first team, both players went out on loan to Belgium when they were first signed by the club. Sheffield United need their new arrivals to hit the ground running if they are to have any chance of staying in the division. There is a clear profile to the club's signings. Trusty, Traore, Slimani and Larouci have a combined average age of just 22. There is a lot of upside there, with resale values clearly in mind following the club's financial problems last season, but there's also plenty of risk. Without the loan market, it seems unlikely that Sheffield United would have won promotion last season, and the same is likely to be true of their survival hopes this time around. failure to bring Tommy Doyle and James McAtee back to Bramall Lane on loan from Manchester City this season, combined with the loss of Ndiaye Berg, means that you could make a really compelling case that Sheffield United have lost 4 of their 5 best players from last season, and that they will be heading into a Premier League campaign with a weaker starting 11 and squad of players that they had in the Championship last term. Put kindly, it's not ideal. What's more, the fact that Sheffield United signed Yasser Larouci on loan from Troyes with a view to a permanent means that they only have 1 loan spot remaining this season. Make no mistake, that will be utilised, but the pressure on utilising it on the right player is now immense. At the time of recording, it is widely reported that Lamel midfielder Vinicius Souza, who spent last season on loan with Espanyol, will be the next player through the door at Bramall Lane. A more defensive-minded midfielder, Souza earned plaudits for his performances last season, despite the fact that Espanyol were relegated. Expected to cost the club a fraction over £10 million, Souza seems like a replacement for Berg, and will reportedly earn the same £40,000 a week salary that Berg was demanding, leaving some Sheffield United fans to question why they weren't willing to offer those same terms to Berg. The uncertainty at Sheffield United is, in large part, a result of ongoing takeover talks. Sheffield United are owned by Abdullah bin Musaid Al Saud, who is a relatively low-ranking member of the ruling House of Saud. Reported to have a personal fortune of around $200 million, Abdullah bought a 50% stake in the Blades, then in League One, almost exactly a decade ago. And in 2018, he took full control of the club after winning a High Court judgment against former co-owner Kevin McCabe. In 2019, Abdullah appointed fellow Saudi royal Musaad bin Khalid Al Saud as Sheffield United's chairman. Aged 26, Musaad became by far the youngest chairman in the division, but after the Blades finished bottom of the Premier League in 2021, he resigned. Abdullah, who also owns football clubs in France, Belgium, India, and the UAE, has neither the willingness nor the necessary resources to match Sheffield United's ambitions. He is the least wealthy owner in the Premier League, aside from the consortium-backed supporter-owned Luton Town, and he was among the least wealthy owners in the Championship. Abdullah has become increasingly amenable to the idea of selling the Blades in recent years, with sales to Henry Maurice and Dozie Mbuase only falling through in 2022 and 2023 due to EFL concerns about the levels and sources of their wealth. Now he apparently wants to maintain a minority interest in the club, which he values at £170 million, but he is still willing to part with a controlling stake to get more money into the club. That likely limits the number of potential suitors, as Abdullah maintains that he still wants to be, quote, involved in the running of the club, whatever that means, but he claims that talks are ongoing with 2 or 3 seriously interested parties. If I wanted to steelman Sheffield United's survival hopes and prospects this season, I would point to the fact that Paul Heckingbottom has overcome adversity in the past and done a magnificent job, surprising a lot of people in the process. They have signed some exciting young players with heaps of potential, and unlike when they came down in 2021, this season they will be playing in front of a packed-out Bramall Lane every other week in a city that is obsessed with football. If I wanted to strawman the Blades' prospects, and regrettably, it isn't difficult, I'd point to the loss of 4 of their 5 best players from last season, the fact that none of their signings have played a single minute of Premier League football between them. There is still massive uncertainty off the pitch surrounding the club's ownership structure, and it is certainly arguable that their current squad is even weaker, or at least no stronger, than the one which finished bottom of the Premier League in the 2020-21 season, with the joint most defeats in the entire history of the division, tied with Derby County in 2007-08. Yeah, I mean, when you put it like that, on the bright side, and admittedly, this is setting a low bar, Sheffield United shouldn't have any unpaid bills this season, their training ground should be permanently usable, and even if they do go down, and regardless of who owns them, they ought to be in much better shape thanks to Premier League revenue and a fresh injection of parachute payments. Even if they had a super rich owner and were run like a well-oiled machine, relegation is always going to be a risk for newly promoted clubs. And making sure that you're well prepared should the worst happen can be as important, if not even more important, than throwing the kitchen sink at survival. There is still time for Sheffield United, around 3 weeks until the transfer window slams shut, for them to make those preparations and to get on top of players' contracts. For now though, they are a newly promoted club with the feel of one that has just been relegated. And perhaps that is because, in the eyes of many of the club supporters, they already have. That is it for today's video, but thank you all very much, as ever, for watching. I hope that you enjoyed it. Hit the like button if that was the case, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and of course, it goes without saying, make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on both for this channel and for my second channel, both of which should be on or about to appear on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might fancy watching after this one. You can also find me on Twitter or on Instagram via the username @HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.